The pearls came to Ilse in a plain wooden box the morning after the funeral, and by the afternoon a footman had come to take them away again. He was very sorry, he said, standing in the doorway of the linen room, with his cap turned round and round in his hands. It was the mistress's order. Everything of the late Madame Vaudrey's, every ribbon, every glove, every string of pearls, was to be inventoried and held in the muniment room until the estate was settled. Nothing was to remain in the servants' quarters. Nothing was to be kept back. He hoped Ilse understood. It was not personal. It was only that a house in mourning had to keep its accounts straight, and the new mistress was very particular about accounts. Ilse understood. She had been at Marenhall long enough to understand a great many things that were never said aloud. She lifted the box from the shelf where she had set it the night before and placed it in his waiting hands. The pearls inside made a small shifting sound, a whisper of round things settling against one another, and then they were gone down the corridor and Ilse was alone again among the folded sheets and the smell of cold starch. She did not weep. She had learned, over a long and careful year, that weeping was a currency, and that in a house like this one, there were always people watching to see whether you would spend it. So she smoothed her apron with both hands, and she went back to the counting of pillow slips, and if her fingers were not quite steady, she did not let herself notice. It was 3 days later that the notice went up. It was pinned to the baize board in the servants' passage, where the day's orders and the tradesmen's bills and the occasional stern reminder about candle ends were all displayed for the household to read. This one was written in a fine, slanting hand that everyone recognized as belonging to the new mistress herself, Madame Corvain, who had married into the great sorrow of Marenhall barely a season past, and now ran it as though she had been born to the keys. Most of the notice was ordinary, a change to the hour of the servants' supper, a prohibition on the burning of lamps in the upper gallery after 10, a reminder that the east stair was not to be used by the lower staff while the family was in residence. But the last line stood by itself, ruled off from the rest by a hard black stroke of the pen, as though the writer had wished to be certain no eye could pass over it by accident. No member of the household staff is to enter the muniment room, nor to handle any item held therein belonging to the late Madame Vaudrey, upon any pretext whatsoever. The contents are under seal. Any breach will be treated as theft and punished accordingly. Ilse read it once. Then, because she did not trust herself, she read it again. She was aware, in the way one is aware of a draft, of the other women in the passage behind her. Greth, the head laundry-maid, had gone very still over her basket. Little Paul, who fetched and carried and repeated everything she heard, had stopped humming, and when Ilse turned at last from the board and walked back toward the linen room with her chin level and her hands folded, she felt their eyes follow her the whole way, and she felt too the particular quality of that watching, not quite pity, not quite triumph, but something braided of both, a sharp and satisfied curiosity, because they all knew, not the whole of it, but enough. They knew that the strange plain girl from the North Country had been the only one to sit with old Madame Vaudrey in the last long weeks, when the family came seldom and the physicians came only to shake their heads. They knew that the old woman, half out of her wits with fever at the end, had pressed her pearls into Ilse's hands and called her by a name that was not Ilse's, a daughter's name, a name from 40 years gone. They knew that the box had come to her and been taken away, and now here was a rule with a black line under it, and though no name was written on that notice, every soul in the passage understood for whom the ink had dried. It was for her. The pearls themselves were nothing to the estate, a modest string, cloudy with age, worth perhaps the price of a good mare. The family had jewels in the bank at Halvergate that would buy the whole county. No, it was not the pearls Madame Corvain feared. It was that a servant had been given something, and remembered, and grieved. It was that grief, in the wrong hands, sometimes learned to ask questions. Ilse reached the linen room and shut the door, and stood with her back against it. Only then, in the gray light and the smell of starch, did she let herself do the one thing she had refused to do in front of the box, the footman, the notice, or the watching women. She let a single tear fall. It ran the length of her cheek and dropped from her jaw and vanished into the collar of her gray gown, and it was the only one she permitted herself, and she wiped its track away with the heel of her hand as though smoothing a crease from cloth. There, spent, and no more, where it came from. She drew a breath. She had work, and beyond the work she had a purpose, and the purpose was older and harder than any pearl, and she could not afford to be seen. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing alone with her back to a closed door, was that she had already been seen, not by the women in the passage, not by Madame Corvain, from the half-landing above the servants' stair, where the family's world looked down into the servants' world through a narrow arched window that everyone below had long forgotten. Was there a man had watched her cross the passage, read the notice twice, and carry her level chin away down the corridor. He had watched, and he had marked the thing that no one below had marked, because they had all been too busy watching her hands and her face. He had seen the collar of her gown move once as something fell into it. And the Duke of Marenhall, who had not felt curious about anything at all in a very long time, found himself wondering what it was that a laundry girl could have to weep for, and why. Of all the griefs in his grieving house, hers was the one she had taken such care to hide. There was a horse at Marenhall that no one could ride, and his name was Sever. He had belonged to the old Duke, the present Duke's father, and he was a great black stallion of 17 hands, with a white star gone yellow at the edges, and a temper so fierce that no groom would go near him unless he must. Since the old Duke's death, he had stood in the far loose box at the end of the stable range, and the head groom, a leathery, silent man named Osprey, fed him and watered him, and otherwise left him strictly alone, as one leaves alone a fire that has learned to burn without fuel. The horse screamed sometimes in the night. The stable boys crossed themselves. It was said that Sever was waiting for a master who was in the ground, and that he would kill anyone who tried to take that master's place. And after a while the saying hardened into a rule, and the rule was simply this: you did not go near the black horse. Elsa went near the black horse for the first time by accident. She had been sent with a message to Osprey about the airing of the carriage rugs, and the yard was empty in the blue hour before supper, and she had come round the end of the range, and there he was, an enormous darkness against the darkening sky, his head thrust over the half-door, his ears flat, his eye rolling white. She should have gone back. Every instinct in the house said go back. Instead she stopped where she was, a good spear's length from the door, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she looked at him. He looked at her. 1 breath. 2. She could hear the great bellows of his lungs, could see the steam of his breath uncoil in the cold. His ears came up by a degree, and then by another. And then, she would not have believed it, had she not felt the warmth of him. He stretched his neck out over the door as far as it would go, slow as a question, and touched his soft nose to the crown of her bowed head, and stood there breathing into her hair. Osprey, coming round the corner with a bucket, stopped dead and made no sound at all. After that it was a thing that happened not sought. Ilse never sought it. She had no bread to bring him and no time to spare, and she knew, as well as anyone, what the household would make of a laundry girl who had bewitched the killing horse. But she found, when her errands took her through the yard, that he would leave whatever corner he stood in and come to the door, and that if she stopped for the space of a breath he would lower that terrible head and hold it near her, quiet as a lamp, and something in the awful loneliness of the animal would seem for a moment to ease. She understood it, though. She could never have said so. She knew what it was to be a creature kept alive, out of duty, by people who were afraid of you, in a house full of a grief that no one would name. She knew what it was to wait for someone who was not coming back. When she stood by the loose box in the blue hour, she was not soothing the horse. They were two of a kind, keeping each other company in the cold, and that was a different thing entirely, and the difference was The whole of it. The stable boys saw and whispered. Osprey saw and said nothing, which, from Osprey, was a kind of thunder. And the word climbed, as words in great houses always climb, from the yard to the kitchen, to the still room, to the housekeeper's parlor, until it reached the fine slanting hand and the particular eyes of Madame Corvain, who did not like things she could not account for. "The girl is not to go to the stables," she told Osprey, standing very straight in the doorway of the tack room, with her keys bright at her waist. "The black horse is dangerous. If she is trampled, the fault will be laid at my door, and I will not have it. See that she is kept to the house." "She never offers him anything, madame," Osprey said slowly. "He comes to her. I never saw the like." "Then that is worse," said Madame Corvain, "not better." And she turned on her heel and went, and the keys sang at her waist all the way across the yard. Ilse, when she was told, only inclined her head and said that she understood. She always understood. She kept to the house, and she did not go to the yard in the blue hour, and if the black horse screamed in the night a little oftener than before, that was surely the wind, or the cold, or the ordinary madness of a beast too long alone. But she felt the loss of it more than she would have thought. The horse had asked nothing of her, and given her nothing but the plain animal fact of his nearness, and she had not understood how much she had come to lean on that plainness until it was ruled away with a black stroke of a pen, the same as the pearls, the same as everything. She did not let it show. She had a purpose, and the purpose came before the horse, before the pearls, before her own cold heart. She reminded herself of this each morning as she plaited her hair under her cap. And still, crossing the yard on some daylight errand with the whole household to see her, she would feel the dark head turn to follow her the length of the range, and the great eye rest on her without malice, and she would have to fix her own eyes on the cobbles and walk on, because to stop now was a luxury she could no longer afford, and because she had begun to suspect that the person most dangerous to her at Marenhall was not watching from the yard at all, but from a high window she could not see. Her name was not Ilse. She had chosen the name the way she had chosen the gray gown and the flat northern vowels and the story of the orphan weaver's daughter with nowhere else to go. Chosen it because it was plain, and plain things are not looked at twice. But she had been christened Aurelie Sonnenfeld, in a white church in a town 300 miles to the south, and she had come to Marenhall not for a servant's wages, but for a reckoning that was owed to the dead. Her father had been Anselm Sonnenfeld, and in the small world of those who cared for such things, his name had been a large one. He was a maker and restorer of fine instruments, lutes, viols, the long-necked theorbos that gentlemen commissioned and rarely learned to play, and beyond that he was a collector, patient and shrewd, of the letters and papers of the great composers of the age before. Where another man kept hounds or hunters, Anselm kept a locked cabinet of manuscript, and in that cabinet, among 100 lesser treasures, lay the thing that had killed him. It was a bound volume of songs in the hand of a master long dead, the only complete copy known to exist, worth to the 3 or 4 men in the kingdom who understood its worth, a sum that could not honestly be named. Anselm had meant it for Aurelie. He had told her so 100 times, turning the yellowed leaves by candlelight with his clever ruined hands. "This is yours, little bird. Not to sell, to keep, so that something of me stays in the world after I am gone from it." He had not reckoned on her uncle. Kessler Sonnenfeld was her father's half-brother, a smiling man with soft hands and a great many debts, and when Anselm died of a chill that settled in his chest one hard winter, it was Kessler who arrived first, Kessler who sat with the body, Kessler who produced with tears, with sorrow, with every appearance of grief, a will that no one had seen before, a will that left the house, the workshop, the cabinet, and every leaf of manuscript within it to himself, in trust for the good of the family. The old will, the true will, the one that named Aurelie, could not be found. The lawyer who had drawn it had died the previous spring. The two men who witnessed it were Kessler's own creditors and swore to nothing. Aurelie was 19. She was given a fortnight to remove her personal effects and a purse of coin that would not have kept a governess a season, and she was warned, in her uncle's softest voice, over her father's fresh grave, that a young woman alone in the world did well to be grateful for small mercies and to make no noise. Then the workshop was sold and the manuscripts were sold, and Aurelie Sonnenfeld went out of the town where everyone had known her and did not come back. For a year she vanished into the grey country of the newly poor, a lodging house, a sewing room, a slow education in hunger, and she might have vanished for good. Another gentlewoman quietly ground down to nothing had a letter not found her in the second winter. It came from an old friend of her father's, a half-blind cataloguer named Marsh who had spent his life among other men's libraries. He had heard, he wrote, of her ruin, and he grieved for it, and he was too old and too poor to help her as he wished. But he could give her one thing, and it was this. He did not believe her father's greatest treasures had all been sold. He remembered, for he had helped with the cataloging himself, years before, that Anselm had done a season's work restoring and appraising the vast, neglected music library of a nobleman in the far north, a melancholy great house called Marenhall, seat of the dukes of that name. And he remembered Anselm saying, in the way of a careful man, that he had left certain things there for safekeeping, that the house was a fortress, that a man never knew when his own roof might prove less trustworthy than a stranger's. Marsh could not swear the manuscript was there. He could not swear anything, but if Anselm Sonnenfeld had hidden his daughter's inheritance anywhere in the wide world against the day of Kessler's treachery, then the library at Marenhall was where a wise old friend would go looking. So Aurelie had become Ilse. She had forged with a steady hand and a heart like a stone the character of a plain, honest weaver's girl, and she had walked into the servants' hall at Marenhall a little more than a year past and asked for work and been given it, and set about the slow, patient business of learning a house from below, its stairs and its silences, its rhythms and its watchers, and above all, the one room she needed and could not enter, for the manuscripts, when Anselm left them, would have gone where all such things went in a house like this, into the muniment room, under seal, behind the door, with the black line ruled beneath it. She had thought, in the beginning, that the hard part would be the searching. She had not understood that the hard part would be the waiting, the endless careful invisibility, the swallowing of every grief and every kindness, the daily labor of being no one at all. She had wept for old Madame Vaudry, who had been gentle to her when gentleness cost the old woman nothing, and that weeping had nearly undone a year of care. She could not afford another slip. She could not afford the horse or the pearls or the single tear in the linen room. And she certainly could not afford what she had, only that week begun to understand, turning it over in the dark of her narrow bed, with a cold that had nothing to do with the northern night. That the muniment room and its seal and the black-lined notice forbidding any soul to touch what lay within were all the doing of the new mistress of Marenhall. That the new mistress had come to the house barely a season past out of a family in the south that no one here quite knew, and that Madame Corvain, before her marriage, before her keys, before she had ever set her fine slanting hand to a page, had been born Corvain only by that marriage, her name before it, the name Aurelie had heard spoken just once, idly, by a footman who did not know he was driving a blade between a listening girl's ribs, had been Sonnenfeld. The smiling uncle had a daughter, and the daughter had married the grief of Marenhall, and taken its keys, and sealed the one door in all the world that Aurelie had crossed 300 miles to open. For a full year, before the woman came, Aurelie had been almost safe. The old duke was in his grave, and his sister, Madame Vaudry, kept to her rooms with her failing heart, and the great house was run in a loose, grieving way by an understeward who cared for little beyond the wine cellar. In such a house, a plain girl could go quietly about learning corridors, marking which doors were locked, And when, drawing no eye, she had come within a hair of her purpose more than once, she had needed only time. Then at the turning of the year, Lord Emeric Corvain had brought home a wife. Emery was the Duke's younger brother, a handsome, restless, feckless man who preferred the racing towns of the south to the cold north of his birth, and who had married, everyone agreed, rather beneath the family and rather above his means. His bride was a slight, elegant woman, some years his elder, with pale, steady eyes and a way of holding herself very still. And within a fortnight of her arrival it was plain to the whole household that Lord Emeric had brought home not merely a wife, but a mistress in the older sense, had been laid there by right. The grieving Duke, who wished only to be left alone with his ledgers and his silence, gave up the keys without a murmur. Emeric himself was gone again within the month, off to some meeting or match in the south, and did not much return. So the house came to be ruled by Madame Corvain. And Madame Corvain, born Sonnenfeld, was the daughter of the man who had robbed Aurelie of everything she had. Aurelie learned it, as she had learned it, from a footman's idle chatter, and she had gone on folding linen with her face composed while the floor tilted under her. She did the sum 100 times that night, and it came to the same total every time. Her cousin, her enemy's own child, grown and married and set in authority directly above her. In the one house on earth Aurelie could not afford to leave. It was as though she had crept for a year toward a sleeping lion and looked up at last to find its keeper standing over her with a lamp. The question that mattered, the only question, was whether the keeper would know her face. They were first cousins. But they had met, in all their lives, perhaps 3 times, and those in childhood, at gatherings Aurelie could barely recall. A wedding, a name day, a long, dull afternoon in a garden. Aurelie had been a leggy girl of 8 or 9 then, and was a grief-worn woman now, plainer, thinner. Her bright hair dulled under a cap and darkened, she had made sure, with careful applications of walnut water. She spoke in flat northern vowels. She kept her eyes down. Every art she possessed she bent toward being the last person in any room that anyone would look at twice. And still, when Madame Corvain's pale gaze passed over her, Aurelie's heart stopped in her chest like a clock struck with a hammer. It happened for the first time in the long dining room, on a morning when Aurelie was set to polishing the chairbacks and the mistress came through unannounced to count the plate. Corvain moved down the row of servants without a word, and Aurelie bent to her work and made herself small, and felt the cool attention arrive and settle on the back of her neck and stay there, a beat, 2 beats, 3, longer than a mistress spares a chair-polishing girl. When she dared to glance up, the pale eyes were fixed on her with a small line of puzzlement between the brows, the look of a woman trying to recall where she has set down a thing she is sure she owns. "You," said Madame Corvain. "How long have you been at Marenhall?" "Above a year, madame." The northern vowels came out flat and true. "Your name?" "Ilse, madame, Ilse. Brant, Ilse." Corvain repeated it the way one turns a coin to read its stamp. The little line stayed a moment longer between her brows. Then something in her decided the coin was common, and the line smoothed away. "You have an idle look about you. See that you keep busy. I dislike a servant with time to think." And she moved on down the row, and Aurelie breathed again, and the breath was like swallowing a blade. It was not the last time. It became, that season, the shape of Aurelie's days, the sealed door she could not reach, and the pale, watchful eyes that would not quite let her be. For Madame Corvain had a genius for control, and a servant she could not entirely account for was a burr under her skin. She could not have said why the plain northern girl unsettled her, and because she could not say why, she did the thing such women always do. She made the girl's life small. Aurelie was moved off the light work of the family rooms and set to the heavy, the cold, the endless, the scouring of the scullery flags at dawn, the beating of the passage runners, the sorting of the mildewed hangings in the cellars where the damp got into the bones. Her hours were filled to the last minute, so that she fell onto her pallet each night, too spent to think, let alone to search. It was a campaign, and Orly knew its purpose, for she had seen it worked on others, to grind a servant down until she gave notice of her own accord and took her splinter out of the door with her. She endured it with the same still face she wore for everything. She would not give notice. She could not. The manuscript was 30 feet from where she scrubbed. Behind a sealed door, her own cousin had ruled with a black line, and every day the woman watched her a little longer. And one gray afternoon, passing the housekeeper's parlor with a pail, Aurélie heard her cousin's voice through the half-opened door, low and pale and precise, saying a thing that stopped the blood in her veins. The girl, Brant. I want to know where she comes from. Right to the parish she names, and to the last house she claims served. I have a fancy, said Madame Corvain, that she is not what she says. The Duke of Marenhall had schooled himself, over 2 hard years, not to feel things, and he had been succeeding until the morning he looked down through the little arched window and saw a laundry girl weep one tear and hide it. His name was Rennick Corvain, and he was 31, and he had inherited in the space of 2 hard years a title, a fortune, a ruinously large house, and more grief than he knew what to do with. First, his father dropped dead in the saddle on the winter downs, the black horse Sever coming home riderless, with the reins trailing. Then this past autumn, his Aunt Vaudry, who had half raised him after his mother died, gone out like a candle in her own bed, with only a servant to hold her hand, because Rennick himself had been shut in his study with the drainage accounts, and had not thought the end so near. He carried that. He would always carry that. He had learned that grief, if you gave it no door, would eventually stop knocking. So he gave it no door. He rose early and worked late, and buried himself in the vast dull machinery of the estate, rents, timber, the failing coal at Halvergate, the endless letters, and he found that if he filled every hour he could get through the days without once having to feel the size of what was gone. He had let his brother's wife take the household because it was one more door he could close. He did not much like the woman. He liked that she asked nothing of him. He had not expected to be undone by a stranger's collar. But the image would not leave him. The plain girl in the servants' passage reading the notice twice, the level chin, the small movement at her throat as the tear fell and vanished, and the way she had not once let her face change. He knew that discipline. He practiced it himself. Every waking hour, to see it worn by a laundry maid, worn better than he wore it, had struck some buried nerve, and now he found, to his irritation, that he was looking for her. She was not hard to find. Once he began to look, for she was everywhere and nowhere at once. A flat gray shape at the end of a corridor, a pair of reddened hands lifting a scuttle. He had passed her 100 times, he realized, and never seen her, because she had taken such trouble not to be seen. And that too snagged at him, for in Rennick's experience everyone at Marenhall wanted to be seen by him. The footman stood straighter when he came. The maids blushed or bobbed or found some small excuse to be in his eye. Even his brother's clever wife arranged herself, when they met, at her best advantage. It was the tax a duke paid. He had ceased to notice it the way one ceases to notice a smell. Only this one girl paid nothing. She lowered her eyes and did her work, and wished plainly and entirely to be invisible to him. He could not stop wondering why. The business with the horse reached in through Osprey, who was not a talking man, and so was believed. The head groom had come to him about the winter feed, and in leaving had paused at the door and said, in his slow way, that the black horse had let a body near him. Rennick had looked up. Sever had not let a body near him in 2 years. He had driven off every groom who tried so much as to bring him water. Who? The Duke asked. One of the maids, Osprey said. Never feeds him, never coaxes him. He just goes to her, your grace, puts his head down like a lamb. I never saw the like in 40 years. And Rennick, who had loved that vicious animal as a boy and given him up for lost with everything else, had felt something turn over in his chest that he had thought long dead. The same girl. He did not need to ask. He knew it was the same girl. After that, he watched her openly, which is to say, he watched her the way a proud man watches, from windows over the top of a ledger, through the crack of a study door. He saw his brother's wife move her to the hardest work in the house, and saw the girl take it without a word or a tear, and something in him that had been asleep began to bank a slow and dangerous coal of anger. He told himself it was the ordinary anger of a master who dislikes waste. A servant with the wit to gentle sever and the bearing of a duchess ought not to be scouring flags in the dark. He told himself several things. None of them explained why he had taken to lingering in the library each afternoon at the hour she came to dust it, nor why the room felt colder on the days she did not come. One evening, unable to give his attention to a single figure on the page before him, Rennick rose and went to the tall shelf in the corner where the household's older ledgers were kept, and took down the book of servants' engagements and found the entry in the understeward's careless hand from more than a year before. Brand, Ilse, laundry. Character from and then a parish name he did not know, in a county he did not know, and a former place he had never heard of. He stood a long time with the book open in his hands. It was nothing. A maid had a history, as all people had histories. And yet the name sat wrong on the page, the way a copied signature sits wrong beside the true one, and Rennick Corvain, who trusted above all things his own cold eye for a thing that did not add, closed the book slowly and decided that he would learn who the gray girl was, whatever it cost his pride to ask. The Dowager Duchess came to Marenhall the following week, as she came twice a year, in a great old-fashioned traveling carriage that smelled of leather and dried lavender, and the whole house braced itself the way a garden braces for weather. Lady Adeline was Rennick's grandmother, past 80 and sharp as a lancet, a small upright woman in perpetual gray silk who had buried a husband and a son and a daughter and refused on principle to be diminished by any of it. She saw everything. She had seen within a day of her arrival that her grandson was wearing himself to a wire, and that her grandson's brother had married a cold, clever woman who counted the spoons, and she had said as much to Rennick at dinner in front of the footmen, because at 80 she considered tact a luxury she had earned the right to spend. It was Lady Adeline who sent for the gray girl on the third day, on a pretext that fooled no one. Orley came to the small south sitting room with a work-basket of mending as bidden, and found the old lady by the fire with a shawl over her knees and the black horse's history somehow already in her possession, for the first thing she said without looking up was, "You are the one Sever has taken to." "I do nothing to encourage him, your grace." It was what she said now to everyone, and it had the merit of being true. "I did not say you did." The old eyes came up pale and bright as her grandson's, but warmer, and rested on Aurelie's face with a frank and terrible attention. "Sit there, where I can see you." "I am too old to shout across a room." Aurelie sat, and kept her eyes on the mending, and threaded her needle with hands she was proud to see did not shake. "How is your grief, child?" said the dowager. The needle stopped. It was not a question anyone had asked her in 2 years. "Your grace, you heard me. Everyone in this house is drowning in it, and no one will name it, which is the northern way, and a very stupid way it is, too. My son is in the ground, and my grandson has walled himself up alive to keep from feeling it, and that poor devil of a horse screams half the night for a master who will not come, and now, here is a girl who folds linen with the face of a woman at a graveside. So I ask you plainly, because no one else in this benighted house will ask anyone anything true, how is your grief?" Aurelie found to her horror that her throat had closed. She looked hard at the mending. "I don't take your meaning, your grace." "No," said Lady Adeline not unkindly. "You take it very well, and you would rather die than let me see it. I know the breed, I am the breed." She was quiet a moment and the fire ticked, and when she spoke again her voice had changed. "Let me tell you a thing I have learned in 80 years. and then you may go back to your needle and pretend I said none of it. There is a difference, girl, between a thing that is kept and a thing that is cherished. My grandson keeps this house. He counts it and secures it and seals its doors, and it is perishing under his hand for all that, because keeping is not caring, and a lock is not the same as love, and there is a difference too. The pale eyes did not waver between what a person is owed and what a person is given. To give a body what you like, the look of giving is charity, and it costs you nothing, and it buys you a warm feeling. But to render up what is truly owed, that is harder, for it admits a wrong was done, and most people would sooner die than admit that. That is the whole trouble with the world in my experience. It is very full of things that are kept, and very empty of things that are cherished, and stuffed to the rafters with debts that no one will own. She let that settle. Then, mildly, as if remarking on the weather, "That is a scholar's way of sitting, by the way. Whoever taught you your letters taught you more than a laundress needs, and those are not a laundress's hands, however you have roughened them." Aurelie's blood went to water. She kept her eyes down and her voice flat. "My mother was in service to a good family. Your Grace, I picked up my letters at the schoolroom door." The old lady did not believe it. That much was plain, and it was equally plain that she did not intend for now to say so. She reached out one dry, papery hand and, before Aurelie could draw back, laid it lightly over the girl's roughened knuckles. The first willing, gentle touch Aurelie had felt from another living soul in longer than she could bear to reckon, and it undid her far more surely than any cruelty had ever done. She had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep her face still. "There," said Lady Adeline softly, watching her fight it. "You need not tell me." "Not yet. I have kept harder secrets than yours and told none of them." She sat back and drew her shawl about her, and became again a small, sharp old woman by a fire. "But hear me, child, for I will say this once, and then hold my peace. Gosh, that horse knows what you are, though he could not say it, and I begin to know it, though I will not say it, and my grandson," she paused, "my grandson has begun to look at you in a way he has not looked at anything since we put his father in the earth. So you would be wise to ask yourself how long a thing can go on being hidden in a house where 3 separate creatures have started, each in their own tongue, to notice it. Now, take your basket and go and send me the girl Pole with more coal." And Ilsa, the name came edged with the faintest irony, as though the old woman held it up to the light and found it wanting. "Do not scrub those good hands to the bone on my grandson's floors. It would be a waste, and I have seen quite enough waste for one lifetime." The thing that forced her hand was a length of oilcloth and a wheelwright's bill. Aurelie found them by accident, carrying coal past the steward's little office, where the door stood ajar, and Madame Corvain's fine slanting hand lay open on the desk to a half-written list. Muniment room. Contents to be crated and carried to Halvergate before the quarter-day. Vaudery effects to be valued and dispersed. Old music and a see. See whether the London man will take the lot. And below it, a note to the carter. Wagons wanted. Thursday Shennight, with oilcloth against the wet. Thursday Shennight, 9 days. In 9 days the sealed room would be emptied, and its contents scattered to a dealer in London, and whatever Aurelie's father had left there against this very hour would go out of Marenhall in a crate under oilcloth, and be lost past all finding. A year of waiting, a year of scoured floors and swallowed grief, and now the whole of it came down to 9 days and a locked iron door. She could not wait for chance. Chance had run out. She would have to make her own. She learned the ways of the muniment room the way she had learned everything at Marenhall, patiently, sidelong, asking nothing. It lay off the old chapel passage behind a door banded with iron, and it had 2 keys. One hung on the great ring at Madame Corvain's waist, and never left her. The other, Aurelie discovered, lived in the steward's key press, which was itself locked, but whose lock was a poor worn thing that a bent bodkin and a steady nerve could persuade, as she had once, long ago, in a life she no longer owned, watched a locksmith persuade its like. She chose the night of the tenant's supper. Once a year the Duke gave a supper for the farmers of the estate in the great tithe barn beyond the paddocks, and the whole household went to serve it, and the house stood all but empty and dark from 8 until near midnight. Madame Corvain would be at the barn presiding, her keys and her pale eyes fixed on the crockery and the cider. It was the one night in the year when no one at Marenhall would think to look for a laundry maid. Aurelie pleaded a fever. She lay on her pallet with her face to the wall until the house had drained of its footsteps, and the last cart had rattled away toward the barn, and the lamps below had all gone out. Then she rose, fully dressed, and took the stub of candle she had hoarded and the bent bodkin she had made, and she went down through the sleeping house like a thing with no weight at all. The chapel passage was black and cold and smelled of stone. Her heart went so hard she could hear it. She knelt at the steward's key press and worked the bodkin in the dark by feel alone. Her breath held the small blind scrapings loud as shovel strokes to her own ears. And at last the worn lock gave with a click that stopped her heart, and then let it go, and the press swung open. Long and cold and heavier than she had dreamed a thing so small could be. The banded door opened without a sound. She had oiled the hinges herself 3 nights running on the pretense of cleaning the passage. Inside the muniment room was a long, low vault, lined with presses and shelves, and it smelled of dust and vellum and the ghost of camphor, and her single candle made a small, trembling island in the dark of it. Boxes stood already half-packed against the wall. Somewhere among all this, she was, suddenly, sickeningly aware of how much this was, lay one bound volume of songs and whatever else her father had thought to hide with it, and she had, at the most, 3 hours to find it. She began where a maker's daughter would begin, not with the family's own papers which stood in ordered rows, but with the odd lots, the uncatalogued, the things that had been put here to be forgotten. A press full of the late Madame Vaudrey's effects, its door still bearing a chalked inventory number, and on the lowest shelf of all, wrapped in a strip of green baize gone gray with age, a flat parcel the length of her 2 hands tied with a faded ribbon that no dealer's list had thought worth a separate line. Her fingers knew it before her eyes did. She had watched her father wrap parcels so 100 times, the same square corners, the same crossed ribbon, the same small, careful knot. She sank to her knees on the cold flags, with the parcel in her lap, and could not for a moment make her hands obey her to untie it. And that was when she heard, from the dark of the chapel passage behind her, the small, unmistakable sound of a boot on stone. She snuffed the candle between finger and thumb before she had drawn breath to think, and the vault went black, black as the inside of a fist, and she pressed herself down against the shelving with the parcel crushed to her breast, and did not move, and did not breathe. A line of gray light stood under the iron door, where she had left it ajar. Across that line, slowly, a shadow moved. The door swung inward. She heard the strike of a lucifer, harsh in the silence, and a lantern flared, and its light swung round the vault and found her, kneeling on the flags, blinking, the gray baize parcel held against her like a shield, caught past all pretending. She lifted her chin. If it was the end, she would meet it upright. But it was not Madame Corvain who stood in the doorway with the lantern raised, and it was not the steward, and it was not any face she had schooled herself to fear. It was the Duke of Marenhall, in his shirt-sleeves, with no cravat and his dark hair loose, looking down at her not with a master's fury but with a still and terrible attention, the look, she understood in one falling instant, of a man who had followed her here on purpose. "So," said Renwick Corvain very quietly, "not the silver, not the plate." His eyes went to the parcel in her arms, and something in his voice she could not name. "Show me what a laundry maid steals from a locked room and calls worth her life. She did not run, because there was nowhere to run. And she did not weep, because she had spent that coin once already and had meant it to be the last. She knelt on the cold flags in the lantern light, and she looked up at him. And she made the last free choice she believed she would ever make. She told him a piece of the truth. "It is not the estates," she said. Her voice came out low, but did not shake. "It never was. It was left here for safekeeping, long before your grace was master, by the man who made it. I have come a very long way to take back what is mine, yours." He came a step into the vault, and the lantern threw his shadow huge across the shelves. A laundress's. No. She was past the flat northern vowels now. There was no use in them, kneeling in the dark with the thing itself in her arms. And her own true voice, when she let it come, was quieter and clearer and cut the cold air like a struck glass. Not a laundress's. Look, if you will. Not believe me. You are a scholar's son in a scholar's house. You will know it when you see it, and then you may call the constable, or not, as you please. She untied the faded ribbon with hands that had stopped shaking because there was nothing left to be afraid of, and she folded back the gray baize on her knees in the lantern light, and there it was. A slim book bound in worn calf, its spine tooled in a pattern of leaves. She opened it to the first leaf and held it up so the light fell on the page, and the page was covered edge to edge in the close brown ink of a hand. 2 centuries dead, bar upon bar of music, the notes strung along their staves like beads, and beneath them words in an old and courtly tongue. Rennick Corvain went very still. He knew it. She saw the knowing move across his face like weather. He was a scholar's son, and his father had loved this music library above every other thing at Marenhall, and he knew the worth of such leaves in his blood even when his mind had turned to drains and coal. He set the lantern down on a packing case, and he knelt. The Duke of Marenhall knelt on the stone floor of his own muniment room, opposite a maid he had believed a thief, and he did not take the book from her. He only looked at it, and then at her, as though the two were a single riddle he had at last been given the first word of. "Read it," he said. "Your Grace, you said I would know it when I saw it. Very well." "I know old vellum, and I know a fine hand." His gray eyes came up to hers. "But any thief with wit enough to choose this and leave the plate could have learned that much. So read it to me. If it is truly yours, if you are what you are letting me begin to think you are, then read." It was the same test, she understood, that his grandmother had set with a touch of the hand and a word about scholars' fingers. The test this whole cold family set, in their different tongues, on everyone who came near them. Show me the true thing under the outside of you. And she was so bone-tired of the outside of herself that she almost welcomed it. She looked down at the page. She had not sung in 2 years. She had not let herself, but her father had taught her this very tongue at his knee, and taught her to hear the shape of a melody straight off the staff, the way another child is taught its letters. And it was in her past, all forgetting. She drew a breath. And there in the cold vault, barely above a whisper, she sang the first phrase of a song, written by a hand long turned to dust. And it was true, every interval of it true, the old words falling into place as easily as her own name. She sang perhaps 8 bars. Then the words blurred on the page, and she stopped and looked up, and found that the Duke of Marenhall had turned his face away. "My father," he said, when he could, and his voice was not steady at all now, "used to have this room full of such singing. Before he would have the windows open in summer and you could hear it in the yard. I had forgotten. I have made myself forget a great many things." He passed a hand across his eyes, once, roughly, the gesture of a man unpracticed at it. "My aunt died in the autumn with only a servant to hold her hand, because I was at my ledgers and could not be troubled to feel that she was dying. My father went out on that black horse and never came back, and I have not once let myself grieve him, because I was afraid that if I began, I should not be able to stop. And there is an estate to run, and a duke may not stop. He looked at her then, wet-eyed and defenseless, a thing she had never thought to see. And here's a stranger kneeling on my floor, singing my father's music, hiding a tear the way I hide mine. Who are you? And Orly, who had guarded her name for a year as a miser guards gold, found that she could not, in the face of that, hold it back one moment longer. Orly, she said, my name is Orly Sonnenfeld. My father made and mended instruments and kept the letters of dead composers, and he did a season's work in this library when I was a child, and left this here against a day he feared was coming. And it came. Her voice broke at last, cleanly, without shame. He is dead. His work was stolen. And the woman who runs this house, Your Grace, the woman who sealed this room, is the daughter of the man who stole it. For a long moment he did not move or speak. The lantern hissed. Somewhere far off across the paddocks, a burst of song rose from the tithe barn, warm and ordinary. A whole world of people who did not know that anything had changed. Then Rennick Corvain rose to his feet and put out his hand and drew her up off the cold stone as though she were made of something that could break. He wrapped the book again in its baize with his own hands and gave it back to her to hold. Take it to your room and hide it. Well, he said, and his voice had steadied into something new, low and hard, and no longer aimed at her at all. Speak of this to no one. Say nothing. Do nothing. Change nothing in your face when you pass her in the corridor. Can you do that a little longer? A very little. I have done it for a year, I know. Something moved in his face that was almost a smile and grieved for not quite being one. God help me. I watched you do it and never saw. But I am awake now. Orly Sonnenfeld. And I mean to set this right, every part of it. And I will need a few days to do it, in a way that cannot be undone. He picked up the lantern. Go, before they come back from the barn, and leave the door and the keys to me. She went, the book warm against her heart. But at the turn of the passage she looked back, and saw him standing in the lit doorway of the sealed room, with his father's silence all around him, and she knew, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with hope, that they had both just stepped past the point where either of them could go back to being what they had been, and that somewhere to the south a letter of inquiry was already on the road, carrying her false name toward the one pair of eyes in all the world that might still know her true one. Madame Corvain made her move first, as such people always do, believing surprise to be a weapon that only they may hold. She came to the Duke 2 mornings later in the library, upright and pale and armored in her own certainty, and she laid before him a small triumph she had been saving. A footman, she said, had found the door of the muniment room unlocked on the night of the tenant's supper, and a candle end on the flags within, and the chalked inventory disturbed. She had made inquiry. She had found that the laundry-maid Brandt had pleaded a fever that night and kept to her room, alone, unwatched, unaccounted for. She had, moreover, this past year formed her own doubts of the girl, and taken the liberty of writing to the parish and the household the creature named for her character. I expect the answers within the week, Your Grace, she said, and I will wager my keys they show her a liar. I would ask your leave to dismiss her now tonight, and to have the constable hold her until the letters come. She is a thief. I have felt it in her from the first. Rennick Corvain heard her out without moving, his fingers steepled, his face giving her nothing, and when she had finished he said, in a voice of pleasant ice, You are mistaken, madam. The pale eyes flickered. Your Grace, the muniment room was opened that night by my own order, and in my own presence. He watched the words land. I had a fancy to look over my father's music before it went south to your London dealer, a matter, I think, you did not trouble to ask my leave upon. I took a candle, and I had the maid Brandt attend me, since she has some skill with old papers and I did not care to grope among the shelves alone. She was there an hour by my command and returned to her bed. There was no theft. There was no fever that I know of. There was a servant obeying her master. He let a silence open. Do you wish to tell me again what you felt in her from the first?" The color went out of Madame Corvain's face in a slow tide. She understood. Aurélie, hearing of it afterward, thought she must have understood everything in that one moment, that she was not being disbelieved but disallowed, that her word had been set against the Duke's and found lighter, and that her careful year of authority had just been taken up and folded and set aside like a thing of no account. It was a public death, though only the two of them stood in the room. She had overplayed and she knew it, and she had nothing left to play. "And the letters I have written," she said at last, very low. "Write what you like to whom you like. It is a free country, and you are my brother's wife." He picked up his pen, a dismissal. "But the girl is under my protection now, madam, and if any harm comes to her in this house, a fall on a stair, a fever, a false charge, any harm at all, I shall look first and last to you for the cause of it. Do we understand one another?" "Yes, your grace," she whispered, and curtsied and went, and the keys at her waist were silent all the way to the door, for she held them still with her hand to keep them from betraying how it shook. Rennick sat a while after she had gone, feeling no triumph, only a cold and settling grief. He had trusted this house to her. He had been glad to. He had shut every door in himself and let a stranger keep the keys, because keeping was easier than caring, and his grandmother had said as much to his face, and he had not listened. Now he saw what his ease had cost a gentlewoman, scrubbing his floors in the dark, watched and worried by the very blood that had ruined her, under his own indifferent roof. The shame of it sat in him like a stone. He knew what his protection had bought her, and what it had not. It had bought her a little time. It had also lit a beacon over her head. By nightfall, the whole servants' hall would know that the Duke had set his word against the mistresses for the sake of the grey laundry maid, and there is no shelter so exposed as a great man's favor. He had drawn Madame Corvain's poison off Aurélie and into himself, but he had not drawn her fangs. And somewhere to the south her letters were flying, and behind those letters, he did not doubt, stood a smiling man with soft hands who had stolen a girl's whole life once already, and would not scruple to do it again to keep it. The reckoning was coming to Marenhall whether Rennick willed it or no. He found he did not wish to wait for it on his back foot. Receiving it, he meant to send for it and choose the ground, and be standing when it came. He drew a fresh sheet toward him, and began in his hard, clear hand to write to a man in the south he had never met, one Kessler Sonnenfeld, of whom he wrote. He had lately heard a great deal, and whom he now most warmly invited to be his guest at Marenhall. They opened the parcel together, the third night, in the library, with the door barred, and it gave up more than either of them had dared to hope. The book of songs was only the half of it. Wrapped within the same green baize, her father had folded a portfolio of papers, tied and sealed, and the seal was his own. Aurélie knew the little device of a lute and a star the moment the candlelight caught it, and had to stop and press her knuckles to her mouth before she could go on. Rennick did not hurry her. He had learned, this strange week, the trick of simply waiting beside her while she mastered a thing, and it turned out he was good at it. This man who could not sit still for grief, he could be still for hers. But inside the portfolio lay her whole stolen self, set down in her father's steady hand. There was a letter addressed to the late Duke of Marenhall, in which Anselm Sonnenfeld thanked his patron for a season's friendship, and confided, plainly, that he feared for the future, that his health was failing, that his half-brother Kessler had fallen among moneylenders, and had begun to speak of the manuscripts as though they were already his, and that he did not trust his own roof to keep his daughter's inheritance safe from such a man. "I beg your grace," the letter ran, "to hold these things for my Aurélie until she is of an age to keep them herself. She is all I have, and all I shall leave. If I am gone before I can send for them, let them be given into her hands and no others." There was a copy of Anselm's true will, in which the house, the workshop, and every leaf of manuscript passed to Aurélie alone, and there was a deed of gift drawn and witnessed and sealed years before Kessler's forgery was ever dreamed of, making over to Aurelie Sonnenfeld the whole of her father's collection past any court's undoing. He knew, Aurelie said when she could speak. All that time, he knew what his brother was, and he never told me because he did not want me to be afraid. He just made it safe. 300 miles away, in a stranger's house, behind an iron door. And then he died before he could send for it, and it sat here, and no one knew. She laughed, a small, wet, broken sound. The old Duke must have meant to keep his word. And then he died too, out on that horse. And it all just waited. It waited for you, said Rennick. But it was the last thing in the parcel that undid her past all holding. At the very bottom, wrapped again in its own scrap of silk, lay a string of pearls, cloudy with age, modest, worth the price of a good mare and no more, and Aurelie knew them in her hands before her mind could catch up, because she had seen them 100 times in a portrait that had hung by her childhood bed, about the throat of a laughing young woman she could barely remember. Her mother's pearls, her mother Liesel, who had died when Aurelie was 4, and whose face she had lost, and whose pearls she had believed sold with everything else. A folded note lay with them, and it was not in her father's hand, but in a finer, older one, a woman's. These were your mother's, it read. She and I were girls together this summer. Your father worked at Marenhall, and I have never had a dearer friend. When she died, she bade me keep them for you against your growing, for she feared they would be lost in a house of scholars, who never remember where they set a thing down. I have kept them 40 years. If you are reading this, then you have come at last, as I always prayed you would. Wear them, and think of her, and know that she was loved here. V. Madame Vaudrey, the old woman Aurelie had sat with through the long last weeks. The old woman who, half out of her wits at the end, had pressed a string of pearls into a strange maid's hands, and called her by her dead friend's name Liesel, because she had seen at the very last, through the walnut water and the gray gown and the flat borrowed vowels, the daughter of the friend of her girlhood, come home at last and not knowing it. She had gathered these pearls once already alone, in a linen room, and let them be taken from her, and shed one secret tear for a grief she thought no one would ever share. Now she gathered them again, and this time she was not alone, and she did not hide her tears, and Rennick Corvain sat beside her in the barred library, and let her weep for her mother and her father and the whole stolen middle of her life, and said nothing at all, because he had learned that too. I will not give you these back, he said at last, gently, when the storm of it had passed, nor the book, nor the papers. A gift returned is charity, and you are owed no charity. My grandmother would have my hide for the word. These are yours. They were always yours. All I mean to do. And here his jaw set, and the softness went out of his voice, replaced by something colder and more purposeful, is make certain that the whole of this house, and one guest now traveling toward it, is made to say so, aloud, past all taking back. For Kessler Sonnenfeld had answered the Duke's warm invitation. He was coming north. He would arrive within the week, all smiles, to pay his respects to the great family his daughter had married into not knowing that his daughter's careful letters and his own dead brother's careful parcel were about to meet, at last, in the one room at Marenhall, where he had never guessed they both lay hidden. Colt, Kessler Sonnenfeld arrived on a bright, hard morning with a new coat and 40 years of practice at seeming trustworthy, and the Duke received him in the library, where the trap had been laid with the same care another man might lay a table. He was a large, soft, smiling man, Aurelie's uncle, grayer than she remembered, but otherwise the same, with the same warm, reaching voice that had spoken so gently over her father's grave while it robbed her. He had come, he explained, to thank his grace for the honor done his family by the match, and to assure the Duke that the Sonnenfelds, though not titled, were people of the first respectability. His daughter, Madame Corvain, stood a little apart by the window, pale and rigid, and Aurélie, watching from the shadow by the door where the Duke had bidden her wait, saw that the cousin's certainty had cracked at last. She did not know what her father had been summoned for, and it frightened her. The dowager sat by the fire, in her grey silk, ostensibly at her needlework, missing nothing. "You are a collector, Mr. Sonnenfeld," said the Duke pleasantly, when the smiling man had run down, "as was your late brother, I believe. Anselm Sonnenfeld. He did some work here once in my father's day, on this very library." The smile held, but something behind it went watchful. My poor brother. Yes, a gifted man. Improvident, I am sorry to say, died in debt. Left his affairs in a sad tangle. It fell to me to set them straight as the only near kin. A small, pious sigh. He had a daughter, but well, she was a difficult girl. Ungrateful. She went off into the world against all advice, and we lost sight of her. A grief to the family. "Did you?" said the Duke. He rose and went to the desk, and Aurélie saw her uncle's eyes follow him, and saw the first true unease enter them. On the desk, uncovered now, lay the green baize and its contents, the book of songs, the portfolio, the sealed will, the deed of gift, the pearls in their scrap of silk. Kessler Sonnenfeld looked at them, and Aurélie watched 40 years of smiling drain out of his face like water out of a cracked jug. "You will know these, I think," said Rennick Corvain, and his voice had lost all its pleasantness now. It was the voice she had heard in the muniment room, low and hard and aimed. "Your brother left them here for safekeeping, with a letter begging that they be kept for his daughter and given to no other hand. Here is his true will, that names her sole heir. Here is a deed of gift, sealed and witnessed years before he died, making over to her every leaf of the collection you sold." He lifted the papers one by one and set them down. "You produced a different will, Mr. Sonnenfeld, a later one, witnessed by 2 of your own creditors, and drawn by a lawyer since struck off. You swept in over a dead man before he was cold, cast his daughter into the road with a purse and a warning, and have spent her inheritance these 2 years buying coats." He set down the last paper. "Do I have the shape of it?" Kessler's mouth worked. These are old papers, Your Grace, half forgotten. They prove nothing. The girl is gone. No one knows where. She may be dead these 2 years for all. She is not dead." The Duke turned and held out his hand toward the shadow by the door, and Aurélie stepped out into the light. She had taken off the gray gown. She wore a plain dark dress the dowager had quietly sent up to her room the night before, and she had washed the walnut water from her hair so that it came out at last, the bright chestnut her father had called Little Bird for, and about her throat, where the whole room could see them. She was not the laundry maid, Ilse Brandt. She had never been. She was Aurelia Sonnenfeld, and she walked to the desk and stood beside the Duke of Marenhall and looked her uncle full in the face for the first time in 2 years, and did not lower her eyes. Kessler went gray. "Aurélie," he said, and, "Child, do not," she said very quietly. "Call me child. You said that word to me, over my father's grave when you took his life's work out of my hands. I have heard it enough from you to last me." Madame Corvain, by the window, made a small, strangled sound. She was staring from her father to her cousin, and Aurélie saw the last of it arrive in the pale eyes. The girl she could not place, the burr she could not account for, the face she had half known in the dining room and made herself forget. "You," she breathed. "It was you, all this year, under my own roof. You, and I never—" "You wrote to a parish that never heard of Ilse Brandt," said the Duke, "and the answer, when it comes, will show your maid a fiction." "You are quite right. She was a fiction. This lady was forced to become one because your family made it a crime for her to be herself." He looked at the 2 of them, the smiling thief unsmiling and his daughter unstrung, and the room was very quiet. I could hand you both to the law. The forgery alone would ruin your father, madame, and touch you with it. I have letters enough on this desk to do it. Kessler's knees seemed to give. He caught the back of a chair. But it was Aurélie the Duke looked to, and it was Aurélie's face he read, and what he saw there was not triumph. She was looking at her uncle with something that was almost worse than hatred, a great and final weariness, the look of someone setting down a weight they have carried so long they have forgotten the shape of standing up straight. She did not want him broken. She wanted only to be free of him. But she is owed more than your ruin, Rennick went on, and his voice gentled by a degree. And your ruin would not give it her. So hear what will be. You will restore every penny you had of Anselm Sonnenfeld's estate to the last coin, and my solicitors will see the accounting done within the quarter, where the law shall have the whole tale after all. You will sign, before you leave this room, a full acknowledgment that the will you produced was false, and that this lady is her father's sole and rightful heir. And then you will go south again, Mr. Cocteau, Pra Sonnenfeld, and you will never come within 30 miles of her, or of Marenhall, so long as you live. He turned to the window. As for you, madam, my brother married you, and I will not shame my brother's name by casting his wife into scandal. But you will not keep the keys of this house another hour. My grandmother will find you a small establishment on the Western Holdings, quiet and far, with a decent income and no society to speak of, and there you will live, and here you will not come. That is more mercy than you showed a grieving girl who never wronged you. Take it, and be glad of it. There was no more to say, and they knew it. Kessler signed with a shaking hand what the Duke set before him, and the Dowager witnessed it in her firm old script, and the smiling man went out of the library. Not smiling. A small figure suddenly, his soft hands empty. Madame Corvain followed without a word, and at the door she stopped and looked back once at her cousin. Not in hatred now, but in a kind of dazed and belated understanding, as though only in this last moment did she see the whole size of what her family had done. Then she too was gone, and Aurélie Sonnenfeld stood in the quiet library in her own true name, with her mother's pearls at her throat and her father's music beneath her hand and the Duke of Marenhall beside her, and heard from somewhere out across the paddocks in the bright hard morning the black horse Sever lift up his voice, not screaming now, the way he had screamed in the nights, but calling, long and clear, the way a horse calls to something it has been waiting a great while to see come home. Spring came late to Marenhall, as it always did, and then all at once, and by the time the hawthorn was out along the paddock rails, the great grey house had begun, quietly, to sound like a different place. Music, mostly. Bite note. That was the thing the old servants remarked on to one another, wonderingly over their supper, that you heard music in the house again, of an afternoon drifting down from the long library where the windows now stood open to the mild air. For Aurélie had stayed. She had not stayed as a maid, and not yet as anything the county could quite put a name to, which scandalized the county considerably and troubled Aurélie not at all. Her uncle's money had come north within the quarter, every coin of it, and her father's house in the south was hers again. She was, of a sudden, a woman of her own means and her own name, free to go anywhere in the world she pleased. And she had chosen to remain at Marenhall, because the Duke had asked her to in the awkward roundabout way of a man unused to asking anyone for anything. My father left this library a wilderness, he had said, standing at the foot of the ladder while she perched on the top of it, with a volume in her lap and dust in her hair. 10 years and more of no one to tend it. And I am no scholar. I am a farmer with the title, God help me. I know a drainage ditch from a salter and not much beyond. It wants a proper hand. Your father's hand, a pause, and then with difficulty, the truer thing, or his daughter's. Would you take it on as its curator? There are good rooms in the East Wing, and a salary, and you would be mistress of it entirely, answerable to no one, myself least of all." He had looked up at her and looked quickly away. "It would also mean you did not go, which I find of late that I mind. The thought of your going, I minded a great deal. She had taken it on." So her days were spent now in the room she had once been forbidden to enter, among the books she loved, bringing her father's music and the old Duke's great neglected collection back to life, leaf by leaf. Thomas the joiner had built her new presses to her own design. The green baize parcel had a place of honor in a glass case, the book of songs open to its first page. And beside it, in a small frame, the note in Madame Vaudrey's hand about a friend loved 40 years. Under Orly's care, the library ceased to be a mausoleum of a dead man's grief and became once more the beating heart of the house, and the house healed around it. The Duke had changed, and everyone saw it, though no one said it to his face. The black coats gave way to easier country stuff. The lines that grief had cut around his eyes softened and, once or twice a day now, turned instead to the marks of a man about to smile. He had let himself grieve at last, his father, his aunt, the whole shut-away weight of it, and, grieving it turned out, had not destroyed him, as he had feared for 2 years it would. It had only, slowly, let him live. The black horse was the wonder of the stable-yard. Osprey, who did not exaggerate, told anyone who would listen that he had never in 40 years seen a beast so turned about. Sever's coat had come up glossy, his eye had cleared, and he carried the Duke out over the downs of a morning with a great arched neck and a spring in his step, no longer a mad thing waiting for the dead, but a fine, strong horse in his prime. He would leave any corner of his box to come to Aurelie at the door and put down that terrible head for her hand, and it was, she thought, the plainest true thing in her whole changed life that the first creature at Marenhall to know her had been the one everyone else was afraid of. It was on a green evening in May, walking down through the parkland toward the lake with the horse ambling loose behind them, and the light going gold across the water, that Rennet Corvain stopped on the path and turned to face her. "I am not a quick man, Orly," he said. "You will have marked it. I do not rush at things, not at farming, not at grief, not at this. My grandmother says I would take a fortnight to fall off a cliff." She laughed, and he did not. He was very serious, and his gray eyes did not leave her face. "But I have been slow long enough, and I find my patience with my own slowness has run clean out. I have grown used to your voice in that library, to your shadow crossing mine in the corridor, to knowing that when I come home, you will be in the house. The thought of you not being in it, of you being anywhere, I am not." He stopped and took both her hands in his, roughened still, though softer now than they had been. "I am asking you to stay, not as my curator, as my wife, as the mistress of Marenhall, and of me, and of that ridiculous horse. If you will have a slow and serious man who took a shamefully long time to see what was in front of him." Orly looked at him, at the grieving man who had learned to feel again, and at the great gentle horse behind him who had known her from the first, and beyond them, at the gray house standing warm in the gold light, the house she had come to as an enemy and a stranger and a ghost, and where she had, against every expectation of her life, been finally and fully seen. Rennet, she said, his given name, which she had never once spoken aloud. And it felt like the last lock in her turning free. "I stopped hiding my tears the night you knelt on that cold floor and did not look away. Do you truly imagine I have any thought of leaving?" She lifted her mother's pearls where they lay at her throat, warm now, worn every day, no longer hidden. "I have been waiting a long while for someone to ask me to stay and mean it. Yes, 100 times yes." He did not sweep her up, for it was not his way, and she loved him the better for it. He only drew her hands to his heart and held them there, and stood looking at her in the gold and lengthening light, as though he could not quite believe the world had permitted him this after all its taking. And the black horse Sever, ambling up behind them through the long spring grass, lowered his great head over their joined hands, gentle as a lamp, gentle as a question long ago answered, and the silence of Marenhall, which had been for so long the silence of grief, was at last only the deep and easy quiet of a house where a lost thing had been found, and cherished, and kept.